Economy and Infrastructure Committee public hearing for the inquiry into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the tourism and event sectors continues. Please ensure that mobile phones have been switched to silent and that any background noise is minimised. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I wish to welcome any members of the public that are watching via the live broadcast. My name's Em Veredigan and I'm Chair of the committee. I would like to introduce my fellow committee members, Mr Jep, Mr Quilty, Mr Barden, Mr Talamas, Ms Lovell, Mr Davis, Ms MacArthur. To witnesses appearing before the committee, just read out a short statement. All evidence taken at this hearing is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act 1975 and further subject to the provisions of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during the hearing is protected by law. However, any comment repeated outside the hearing may not be protected. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You'll be provided with a proof version of the transcript following the hearing. Transcripts will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee's website. We welcome your opening comments, but ask that they be kept to a maximum of 5 to 10 minutes to allow plenty of time for discussion. Could you please begin by stating your names for the benefit of our Hansard team and then start your presentation. Over to you, John and Matt.
Okay, John Perring. Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee. I am co-owner and director of dedicated live music venues, the Tote Hotel and Bar Open. I've been running venues for 22 years. Prior to the COVID lockdown in March 2020, we staged approximately 4,000 gigs a year. We are now at about 30% of gig activity and revenues compared to pre-COVID times. The music industry has never been more precarious. I was going to talk about restricted capacities and the effect on live music venues in particular, although still a significant issue for medium-sized venues with band rooms with pre-pandemic working capacities of about 300 to 1,000. Small venues now operate closer to their pre-pandemic capacities. Instead, I wish to highlight both process failings of government in the engagement with the industry and the consequences of these failings, and other areas of need and friction that are likely to be problematic in the near future as we head more to normalised times. The Live Music Roundtable was established by the Victorian Government in, I believe, 2011 by the then Liberal Baillieu Government as an initiative following from the Live Music Accord signed between the music industry and the previous Labor Brumby government. The work of the Live Music Roundtable has been substantial and was supported by both sides of politics and sat until the beginning of the pandemic. It has not sat since, and no plan to, as far as I'm aware. I should declare that I was a signatory to both Live Music Accords and also a long-time member of the Live Music Roundtable in a volunteer and unpaid capacity. The result of this stasis has been that the industry has had no opportunity for formal dialogue with government. The direct result being that the music industry has had to resort to holding that conversation in the media. We have advocated through Music Victoria and created campaigns through Save Our Scene, a collective of like-minded live music venues. The issues that emerged and the government responses were the much-needed emergency financial support for live music venue core funding, which resulted in the Live Music Venues Grant, the introduction of the concept of live music precincts in the Victorian planning provisions to better spatially clarify where the agent of change principle is applied to live music venues, to protect live music venues from opportunistic development whilst venues are uneconomic and undervalued land use, recognising and thus protecting the live music performance infrastructure's irreplaceable cultural value. In November 2020, when inside gigs were again allowed, 2020, there were ridiculous regulatory health constraints placed on live music performance that effectively prevented live music from being staged. Audience had to be spaced 5 metres in front of the performers, who were to be masked and spaced 2 metres apart. Lobbying ultimately removed these mandatory unworkable regulations after 3 weeks, and the situation could have been avoided through consultation. The delay meant that bands were not being programmed prior to the Christmas break, resulting in a delay of 6 to 8 weeks in staging gigs, further financially injuring live music venues. Finally, lobbying by Music Victoria and SOS around the removal of the one person per 2 square metre rule for venues with spaces up to 400 square metres that now comes into law on the 29th of May. Thankfully, government in each case listened to the industry, but in each case it's unnecessarily brought live music venues to the brink. This is hardly an orderly plan for the return of the music industry to COVID normal. This precarity and angst imposed on the industry could have so easily been avoided if the Pan-Government Forum Live Music Roundtable, designed for consultation and to address regulatory impact and reform, had met and done its job. I believe this is a major failing of the Department of Creative Industries, who chair this forum, and of government leadership more generally. If ever there was a time for a forum such as the Live Music Roundtable to step up, engage and lead, this was it and still is. Of course, there remain many critically important issues that affect the live music industry, the art form and its practitioners, audience and workers. These require attention by government, and if ignored will again be ventilated in the public domain and wreak avoidable collateral damage on a weakened community and industry. A list of some of these issues that needed addressing by the Victorian Government are and will be fund and commission research. This is needed to look at the impact of COVID pandemic has had on the Victorian live music economy, its audience, practitioners and businesses, and its infrastructure. Such research should be at pre-pandemic and post-lockdown activity, audience size, impact on artists, their practice and incomes, venue numbers, show numbers and overall economic activity, overall sector size, audience engagement and the impediments to growth and survival, the impact on live music festivals and touring and the business and labour forces that support them, the Music Victoria Live Music Census last carried out in 2017 is now overdue, and there hasn't been a vigorous Victorian industry study since 2011. The economic, social and cultural contribution of venue-based live music in Victoria. Deloitte Access Economics, 2011. Facilitate the development of a recovery plan to return the live music industry back to viability and health, including actionable recommendations and targeted industry assistance where needed, in conjunction with the music industry and led by Music Victoria. Return capacities to all live music venues, independent of band room size, so that they are able to operate at pre-pandemic standing room capacities greater than 1 patron per 2 square metres, not just venues with less than 400 square metres or greater than 1,000 patron capacity.
Here.
Action the development of agreed music industry protocols for future lockdown shutdowns and the ramp up back to full venue capacities in the shortest possible time. Building such protocols will avoid the current ad hoc approach that government adopts now and the necessity for industry to second guess and lobby to correct ill-conceived health regulations. Ensure the consistency of health regulations for live music venues and festivals and that they are consistent with other industries such as sport. Ensure the regulations affecting live music venues are announced at the same time as other industries such as sport and not treat the music industry as an afterthought. Address the impact on the availability and price of insurance for live music venues and festivals, in particular public liability and business interruption insurance. The government needs to adopt policies to lower risks or underwrite policies. Monitor the impact of the EPA's new environmental noise regulations and protocols, in particular their effect on outdoor venues, festivals and events in urban environments. Due to the one-size-fits-all nature of the preset dB limits of the EPA permit system, the industry fears that many events and festivals will become non-compliant and unviable under the new regulations. In the COVID environment, outdoor shows should not be made impossible or impractical to stage. On the contrary, outdoor live music should become a policy priority. Create and enable border permits for musicians, their teams and crews to re-establish confidence and encourage national tours by artists at all levels. Set up a specific forum to explore solutions and address artists and musicians' economic sustainability, including what is needed for the establishment of a specific industry superannuation scheme and access to social security or income insurance for musicians, artists, crew and other music industry gig economy workers. Government leadership in this policy area is desperately needed, and approaches, policy solutions need to be thought through. A viable music industry worth in excess of $1 billion in Victoria cannot be sustained without sustainable careers for musicians and artists, and I believe this to be the elephant in the room. And finally, re-establish a renewed live music roundtable with new terms of reference to be located under the Department of Premier and Cabinet, or alternatively in the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Region, as it appears Creative Victoria have dropped the ball by neglecting to run and chair the Live Music Roundtable. The Live Music Roundtable's agenda should be drawn from the above points, but also with wide consultation. Such a pan-government music industry forum is required to redress the economic and social damage that has been wreaked on both the music community and the industry alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. I've got Matt Jones, Managing Director of the NW Group. Matt, if you could just introduce yourself and give us a short presentation, please. Thank you for joining us live via Zoom.
Well, look, thanks for having me. And my name is Matt Jones. I'm Managing Director of NW Group. I just want to check. You can hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
Great. Look, NW Group, we provide sound, lighting and video equipment and technicians to the live event industry. So we operate a couple of brands in Melbourne, Norwest and Haycom. Every year, NW Group provides technical support to hundreds of live events in Victoria across corporate, theatre, worship, live sport, concert and festivals markets. So if it's a live event, we can be involved. Our business has been operating since as early as the late 70s, and I've been Managing Director of NW Group for the last 15 years. We've played a critical role in the production of many of Victoria's iconic annual and large one-off events. Shows or events such as the Australian Open, the Melbourne International Arts Festival, the International Comedy Festival, AFL Grand Final, Commonwealth Games opening and closing ceremonies, and believe it or not, the International Convention of Jehovah's Witnesses at Etihad, which I understand took the record from Etihad for attendance from the AC/DC concert a few years prior. So who would have thought? As we speak, we've got 8 technical crew, predominantly from Melbourne, so Melbourne-based crew, and they're quarantining in a Tokyo hotel. We've got a couple of containers en route to Tokyo to provide sound and broadcast services for the opening and closing ceremonies of the Tokyo Olympic Games. You know, I make some of the points of these shows to sort of emphasise that Australia and Victoria in particular have an international reputation for their skill sets in the live event industry, and all of us should be immensely proud of that and very focused on preserving that position that we're so privileged and so much work has gone into establishing. Prior to the onset of COVID-19, we employed around 210 full-time staff, and we'd have anything up to an additional 200 or more casual and contract crew across 6 branches in Australia and New Zealand at any given time. Our revenues in 2019 were approximately $50 million per annum. Business events made up around 75% of that, and the balance was in arts, entertainment and sport. So that just shows some of the variety of the sort of events that we're talking about. It's not just music, it's not just sports. There's a very large component of business event activity that is contributing economic growth to Victoria, obviously, as well. And we're pleased to be a part of that. In Melbourne, we employed around 30 full-time staff prior to COVID, and again, similar number of casual and freelance technicians. Like everyone you've heard from, in March 20, our revenues were wiped out completely. At the beginning of the pandemic, we sort of mapped out in our sort of teams, what we thought the 4 stages of our recovery would look like, and we called these survive, recover, revive, and thrive. And the key metrics we've sort of been measuring through the last 14 months were the number of staff we were able to get back to full-time employment, and that was our biggest focus. And of course, absolutely interlinked in that was our revenue pipeline recovery. So survive, just to give you an idea, meant revenues were less than 10% of pre-pandemic levels. And for much of the period from March to October, our revenues in Melbourne were less than 5% of what we'd been trading at. Recover meant those revenues would have increased from 10 to 50%, 50. In other words, half or less. Now, we operate in 6 markets: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Auckland and Wellington. Now, Victoria was the last of our markets to move out of survive, which it did so, I think, January, February. So in January, February, it moved out of, we moved ahead of 10% of the revenues that we'd been running at. And is the only business that remains at recover, while all other businesses in our company at least have now moved to revive. And I want to make this point clearly, because to reiterate, Victoria, the event capital of Australia, which we're also proud of, has been our slowest market to recover. So other states have actually done this better than Victoria, and I'd love to think we could change that as we move forward. Now, my industry colleagues, including Laurie Vidicki and Howard Freeman, Tiny Good and Simon Thulis, and my learned colleague on the other side of the table there, have really outlined to you the incredible impact on their business of COVID and, of course, the restrictions imposed as a result of COVID. And look, simply put, the pandemic and those event restrictions have been devastating for our people, our clients and our shareholders. And most of those shareholders, just like myself, also work in our business and they rely on it for their livelihoods. So rather than spend a lot of time today sort of talking about what's happened over the past 12 months, I think we can all see that there is some kind of recovery coming. But I wanted to give you some insight into what it's like to operate in our market now. And as you see over coming months, you see shows emerge and you think, well, the market's coming back. I want you to understand what it's like at the moment to operate a business in the event sector in Victoria. And perhaps the best way I can do that is through a couple of events that we've been lucky enough to complete over the past 4 or 5 weeks. So we're delighted to be providing technical support for TEG's current tour of Paw Patrol. And if you haven't been, grab some tickets for your children. The first show was scheduled for Perth. It was about 4 weeks ago, I think. We had 2 semi-trailers of equipment en route from Melbourne to Perth when, as we all remember, a couple of weeks ago, Perth called a snap lockdown. The Perth show was postponed. It was originally cancelled, now been postponed. The semi-trailers had to turn away midway between Melbourne and Perth. The crew booked had to be paid for. The logistics costs, the accommodation had to be covered. We've now got to reschedule crew and logistics for a show which luckily will happen later next month, but with all the associated costs of that on top. During the same period, we had a large AGM for Rio Tinto. This was also held over in Perth a couple of weeks back. Once again, with highly skilled Melbourne, Victorian-based crew operating it. This show was designed to proceed under almost any level of restriction, from fully live to full virtual. To ensure our team was on the ground and we could make this happen, and knowing the situation that we're facing at the moment, we needed to send them across 2 weeks beforehand. 2 weeks beforehand. There wasn't anything to do. They just had to go across the 2 weeks. We had to accommodate them for that period. We couldn't risk the fact that quarantining might be reimposed. And some of you will recall that at that stage, we were starting to feel quite good that it might not. And then, of course, we had the latest lockdown over in Perth. So so fortunately the show got to go ahead. It was in full virtual mode, but we were actually able to deliver it. As our crew returned from Perth to Melbourne, they were then required to be tested and isolate for 72 hours due to Perth being an orange zone. Now, I understand that at the time, Victoria was the last state to require isolation and testing coming back out of Perth, taking almost a week longer than other states. Now, had Victoria followed the approach of other states, those staff wouldn't have had to have isolated for the additional 3 days. There was also, just out of interest, no testing available at the airport. So crew needed to travel to Heidelberg to get their tests. Just some little examples of how we could maybe think about making things easier for all of us to get business back up and running. As mentioned earlier, we've got 8 technicians, just about all of them out of Melbourne, currently in isolation and, by the sounds of it, a not particularly lovely hotel in Tokyo. The approval process to get these staff consent to leave Australia and enter Tokyo included a letter of invitation, certificate of eligibility, a written pledge by the Olympic Committee organising committee, sponsorship by our client as inviting company, a travel schedule, 14 days health check data in the lead up to travel. I could go on this list. I'm not going to bore you, other than to say we're still awaiting confirmation that we've actually got quarantine facilities for these guys when they come back home in 4 months' time when the event is completed. So, in summary, our operating environment is vastly improved from that of 12 months ago, where our revenue was zero. However, let's not forget, our turnover in Victoria remains between 10 and 50%, significantly less than half of pre-COVID levels more than 14 months on. Despite that, we're already seeing skill shortages emerge as skilled technicians have left our industry in droves due to the fact to go and find more stable work. And it's really as yet unknown whether those staff are going to actually return to the industry. We continue to face the high risk of event cancellation at any time for any snap lockdowns, not just in Victoria, but as you've heard described, other states. We have seen a huge increase in compliance costs, substantial quarantining requirements, and the mental health aspects of those are weighing heavily on our staff. You can imagine what it's like sitting in a hotel room for 2 weeks in Tokyo with very poor food. And obviously we're having to supplement that by bringing it in. I think you'll agree these are substantial barriers to trading, even though we are seeing a slow reopening. I hope these examples also illustrate to you Victoria has world-class capability in the event sector, and the Victorian event industry is deriving its income not just from Victoria, but interstate and internationally. And I make all of these points not to suggest that the requirements around COVID are unreasonable or unnecessary to manage the COVID risk. We understand that, of course. But I need you to understand that even as we see a gradual reopening of the event sector and you see more shows upcoming, our industry continues to face existential challenges that are disproportionate to other sectors, most other sectors, almost all other sectors. I'm hugely optimistic that demand for events will eventually return to pre-pandemic levels and be a vibrant part of Australia's economy. But if Victoria is going to take advantage of that and retain our position as Australia's arts and events capital, we need government support and to provide support to the sector through this intervening period until international borders reopen, whenever that is, to ensure that when they do and the market bounces back, because it will, the infrastructure required to deliver these incredible events that Melbourne is so famous for, and of which my company is just one tiny part of the supply chain, we need to ensure that that supply chain exists when the demand returns. I think this support could take the form of a couple of things. Confirmation that any future lockdowns would trigger some form of JobKeeper subsidy of $750 a week for both permanent and casual employees. That gives staff confidence to remain within the sector and businesses confident to continue to retain those staff while we wait for the recovery. Targeted industry apprenticeship schemes whereby the cost of new employees is subsidised for the first 12 months to assist with the rebuild of the industry. As I mentioned, we have lost a lot of the talent that existed. Some may come back, Fortunately, the vast majority, as we know through our employment statistics, have been able to find re-employment elsewhere, but that's not going to help us when we try to get our event sector back up and running at full pace. Targeted employment subsidies for new hires in the event sector to give confidence to employers to rehire and invest, and targeted ongoing financial support and or resources for organisations such as Crew Care and Support Act to address the mental health issues emerging in the sector and raise awareness of these services. And I thought Howard Freeman displayed and explained that situation very, very well in his submission a few weeks back. We need simplification of the processes for travelling interstate and internationally, and flexibility in snap lockdown scenarios for the situations I've described. And the final point I'd like to make is that the funding provided to date to the sector, both in terms of the Business Events Grants Program and RISE funding, are a very welcome boost to the sector. And we are already seeing events come through as a result of that, which is fantastic. However, certainly from our perspective and my conversations with my industry peers and colleagues, is that this funding is not making its way through the events supply chain in the form of deposits for future events. So what we would suggest is that an awareness campaign and or directives around what is required from those funding recipients should be looked at, in particular that they must distribute a percentage of funding grants made to the event sector to the event supply chain in the form of deposits for future events. That would be a welcome addition to the funding approvals from our perspective. I'd like to close by thanking in particular Simon Thulis and Save Vic Events for their leadership and advocacy for our sector, and thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Jones, for that comprehensive overview of specifically to your events business, but also the sector more broadly. I might hand over to Mr. Barton, Mr. Quilty, then Mr. Davis, and then we'll go through the rest of the team. Could I just remind committee members just to ask one question first, and if we get a chance, we'll go to a second question. Mr. Barton.
Since the chair's putting very tight limits on us, what we can do, you had a very broad-ranging things you'd like to see, like in terms of restructuring the industry. But what is the number one thing that would help learning on what's happened, and if we're going to be exposed to these snap lockdowns from time to time, and I think that's going to be our world for the next year or so, what would you like to see happen? That one thing. What's your priority?
Well, I think if we got the dialogue sorted out between government and the industry, then a lot of the other issues will get flushed out from there. I think one of the major problems has been that the industry has not known who to talk to. The health people are a bit of a black box, and they are surrounded by
to everyone.
A lot of advisors and public servants, and you've got a lot of them. So it's very hard to sort of penetrate your perspective. You don't know whether you're resonating or not.
Trying to get through a forest.
Yeah, well, exactly right. So, I mean, that's why I was sort of underlining the need for the live music round table. But if we could get that
Get that communication open.
Yeah, get that sorted. All the other issues will then be known to government and they can be addressed accordingly.
Thank you. On that point, I might pass over. If you have anything to add, Matt, otherwise we'll go to Mr. Quilter to ask the next question. Thank you. I think Mr. John gave quite a comprehensive answer. Mr. Quilty, then Mr. Davis, then Mr. Talamas. We'll go. Mm-hmm.
So how is industry recovery different between different states, and how are other states doing things differently that Victoria could be or should be doing?
Is that directed at myself?
Either of you, but probably more Matt.
Well, look, I'll pick that one up. I mean, I think a lot of this goes back, obviously, to the initial stages where, as a consequence of what happened, Melbourne had restrictions in place for a lot longer than other states. I'm not an epidemiologist or a health person, so I don't understand. But when say for instance we had the snap lockdown in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, rather than events being cancelled, there was a board mandate that people just wear masks in the events. Whereas when the snap lockdown occurred in Melbourne, those events were restricted to unmanageable levels. So that's a sort of that's a simple scenario. We understand that snap lockdowns are going to have to happen. That will, we can't hold large concerts during those periods, but it's the length of those restrictions, how long they go on for. And the sort of severity of the restrictions and what's required imposed are another sort of issue. The issue. I think that's the final thing I would add is the path out of this is not very clear from a Melbourne perspective, where we have clearer guidance from a Queensland, New South Wales, over in New Zealand standpoint. There's a clearer path for what's going to happen, and that would be welcome from the industry as well. Just from a planning point of view, I'll finish by saying we've seen a real change in sort of buyer behaviour, and as we recover, people are very, very uncertain about booking and are leaving it till the last minute because everyone just feels uncomfortable about going ahead without knowing. The closer they get to the dead date, the more comfortable they feel, and I think that's because there is that lack of uncertainty about what's going to happen. The path to this being resolved is so uncertain. So a clearer path from Victoria around when we can get back to events, what the requirements are, gives everyone more information on which to base their decisions and feel more confident about booking events moving forward.
Can I just add one other sort of point? Totally endorse everything that was just said, but also, I mean, we were locked down for substantially longer than any other state, and the impact that's had on the surviving organisations, and particularly on their balance sheets, not just their cash flow and on their profit and loss, but on their balance sheets, is going to really need to be addressed, or we will not be able to sort of get back to where we were in pre-pandemic times.
Yeah, thank you. I might actually pass off to Mr. Davis, then Ms. McArthur, then Taylor.
So, look, I've got one question for John and then probably a more general one for both. Essentially, we were locked down for longer, but also much more harshly. The ratios and the rules around access to venues and the size of venues, the number of people could be put in, was much lower here in Victoria than in New South Wales or Queensland or Tasmania. I don't know about New Zealand. I've not done the tables, and I'm happy to provide the Secretariat with my many tabulations of the different rules, but I think it's true to say that they were much harsher.
Yes, that's definitely the case.
And still are.
Yeah, yes, although, at least for us in the smaller venues, as of the 29th, we will be able to go back to similar capacities. They're not the same, but they're workable.
So within those rules, the orders are published by the Chief Health Officer. Everyone can see them. They often come late at night and you're locked down the next day. But leaving that point aside, there are reasonings and briefs and material behind that, and explanations as to why certain ratios are struck and certain rules are struck. Divergent, I might add, from other states. Have you ever seen any of those? Have they provided explanations as to why Victoria was shut down harder, in venues than other states?
Look, it's a very good point. We have not seen the reasoning behind some of the decisions that health made, and we believe that some of those reasonings were not really founded on science, but on assumptions that people were making about how gigs in fact operating. things around, do all people dance at shows? Well, that's simply not the case. That somehow, audiences were always going to sing and therefore aspirate into the venue. Well, we put on original live music. Most people don't know the lyrics to the songs that are being put to them. And you compare that with sport, where people are basically
Cheering
bellowing
and
out
even
their
booing.
lungs, singing the Richmond football song, the yellow and black line, as an example of, high aspiration. But, there are distinct differences.
Do you
Da-
believe those
Mr.
documents should be in the public domain?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I just want to stick to the one question rule because there's so many committee members present here today. We're all very eager to hear from both of you. Mr. MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Look, it was illuminating with the last speaker who told us that 633 million had been injected into the government stakeholder space in this whole events and tourism area. But nothing to business events for Victoria. I don't know how much you got, but given that the government's seen fit to fund its own public service effectively, but not do anything, to ensure that we get out of this stage of random lockdowns for no good reason half the time. Have you got anything to say on those points?
Well, look, we were the beneficiaries of a specific grant for live music venues, and frankly, it saved our bacon. But, just to put that in perspective, between my two venues, we were probably somewhere around, I don't know, about maybe a 4 million annual turnover. So the $100,000 in that, in that context to offset costs, didn't go all the way, and hence to my point that I was saying about how how beaten up we are at the moment, and it's still we're still in a very precarious position. So although and we've been the beneficiary of that of some of that funding, and there's been other things too. There's been lots of little government ones, but. Unlike, for instance, the rest, other portions of the arts sector that are directly funded by government, we don't have access to any of that funding, and maybe there should be a conversation, around how that in fact is the case.
Thank you. Does Matt want to comment?
I think all I can add to that is probably really reiteration of the point I made earlier on, which is, I think the government funding into the either through the business events grant or the RISE funding has been very welcome for the industry. I think what it hasn't been able to achieve to date is giving the supply chain. So there's a long supply chain, right? You've got the venues and the promoters who are putting on the events and housing the events, but then there's this long supply chain of the caterers and the equipment providers and the waiting staff and blah 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 all goes down through. Now I don't see it coming down through the supply chain at the moment. Now I understand that from a venue or promoter's perspective, but I think there is some opportunity to make sure that cash is washing around the supply chain further, because if that supply chain doesn't exist, it's going to be very, very difficult for events to be held when there is the opportunity to do so again.
Thank you. Mr. Tolar, Miss Lovell.
Thank you, John and Matt, for your comprehensive presentation today and coming along and talking to us. We've heard from both today and through the submissions and previous witnesses around the way in which, or the understanding of the sector, the events and festivals and live music sector, around that, the way in which it's understood and the complexity of it, and how it's sometimes categorised in, or sort of putting together as one cohort, if you like, whereas it's been described as a broad church, if you like. And there is that sort of lack of understanding. And when advice has been provided, it hasn't been fit for purpose, if you like. And I understand in John's case, the live music roundtable would be a mechanism to actually be able to address some of those issues and provide that feedback through that. But in terms of the event sector, a specific one-stop shop, if you like, or an ability to be able to access information or contact around events, where to go for advice, and even getting that sort of specific information about events and how where to go for advice, what's happened, or if you need assistance and things like that. Would that be something that would be helpful for the industry, but also to be able to liaise with around understanding the factors and issues that relate to the industry?
Look, much of that knowledge doesn't reside in government. It resides with the various sectors of the industry, and that's why I think you need a forum where it's both got government on it and you've got industry on it, so that that knowledge can essentially be transferred, and policy can be developed. And also, more importantly, when government does have thought bubbles, which they do from time to time, they can be, vigorously tested, as opposed to just being put out there, and implemented, and then suddenly we have to deal with, regulations that are essentially ill-conceived. And I've given you that example around, for instance, the initial health advice, like putting 5 metres in front of the stage, having that distance between audience and band. And almost all the stages in Melbourne couldn't accommodate those offsets, and it meant that certainly none of the small venues could, and it meant that we couldn't put anything greater than a 2 or 3 piece on most of those stages, let alone like a working Latin band, which has got maybe 12 piece.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so the live music roundtable would be the mechanism for that in terms of live music, but in terms of the event sector, there's.
I'd just add from my personal perspective. I mean, there's no way out of this without industry and government collaborating, and again, I draw on that point I made earlier around a pathway out of this. I mean, if we could get a body together that between industry and government could come up with a safe and clear path to normality. These are the factors that will drive these decisions. That would be enormously helpful for confidence, because believe it or not, we'll make our own decisions around that if we can see it, and it's simply, in some ways, it's just you feel more in control if you know what the variables are, and that would be enormously helpful from my perspective. The other thing that I think, and Simon Thurles touched on this as well, was we really appreciate the opportunity as an industry to actually be sitting at this table. It's not an industry, to be honest, that's really been taken that seriously in the past. I hope that out of the various sort of inputs you've had from the different industry players, and will do so over coming weeks, you come away from this understanding this is a real industry, and I absolutely think it does require a body that focuses on it, developing it. Obviously, from a recovery point of view, that's important, but actually beyond the recovery, let's make more of this huge opportunity that we've got in Victoria as such a fantastic sort of event capital, and also, as I've touched on today, the knowledge that is behind it and exporting internationally. It's not certainly by no means just us. There's people doing incredible things, exporting this knowledge, not just internationally but nationally. And I think if nothing else comes of this, but we take this industry more seriously and develop a roadmap for our future, then a great outcome.
Thank you. I might pass on to Mr. Lovell and then Mr. Jep.
Okay, so you mentioned that the live music roundtable, which we've just been discussing, that it wasn't convened, there was no formal dialogue. Can you explain why that wasn't convened? And also, how important is it that it is convened now? Is it, imperative that it's convened today, this week, next week, or whatever, to guide the industry going forward? Also, there was a new minister appointed on the 29th of September for creative industry. Has he ever met with you as the live music industry?
Well, take the first part of the question. You'd have to ask Creative Victoria why it hasn't called the meetings. But I can only surmise that, everyone was running around trying to deal with the pandemic at the time, which we totally understand. But that's no excuse for it not really being active. And the importance of it, that forum exists, it has members, and it should have been utilised. And hopefully, I've sort of covered all the reasons why. In terms of the new minister, no, I haven't met with him. We've mainly, and during the lockdown, we did lots and lots of Zooms with, I don't know, many public servants and many advisors. Really, anyone who talked to us, we would talk to, and
Talk him through how to use the Zoom.
Yes, that's right, and we did penetrate. I mean, government has responded, so that needs to be acknowledged, but. What road we actually made it through, I really don't know. It's like, suddenly something happens and you read it in the press release and you can see that it's been acknowledged, but you don't know which was the door that was open that you actually managed to go through. Now, I've been engaging with government really for a very long time, really since going back to probably 2004 on many, 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 many issues, and it's always been a bit of an issue. Sometimes you get a door in through liquor, sometimes you get it through jobs and precincts, probably more, recently. You never quite know sort of how it's going to work. You put the issue up there and then occasionally you get it over the line.
Yeah.
It's got to find the right person, but, it's...
So I guess what we take out of that is that the government member should take back to the minister that he convenes a meeting with you as a matter of urgency.
Yeah, look, sure. I'm always available.
Thank you. I might pass over to Mr. Jepp to ask the final question for our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Jepp.
Well, I won't try and interpret the answer before I ask the question. Just in relation to vaccinations, we're hearing more and more from the health experts, both domestically and internationally, that the way through COVID is going to be widespread vaccination. That's the program that needs to be implemented and adopted. I'm wondering if that's the case, and the impact, of course, on your industry. What do you think about the current vaccination program that we have here, and do you have any thoughts about what we need to do to that program that will assist your industry?
Look, it's not an area of expertise that really I would sort of want to sort of put an opinion on. All I can say is really bring it on. Sort of the more we get people vaccinated, clearly the more people can move around, and clearly the needs for Fortress Australia are diminished. But, just to give a little example, festival and events, many tours are sort of based around that. So if festivals aren't getting up and the tours aren't happening, that means that, like venues like ours, such as the Tote Hotel in Barrowman, are not getting sideshows. So all the bands that we're putting on at the moment are really all local. So, the faster these health responses are rolled out, it's going to have a flow-on effect to the health of the industry sort of in the longer term.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matt, did you have a view?
Look, from a vaccination point of view, of course, the sooner we can get as many people vaccinated, obviously the better. I was listening to one of the large venues out in Las Vegas this morning. They're now booking large shows. I think Garth Brooks 65,000 in July or something like that. So they're there. It's obviously the path forward for us as a country, and of course as an industry, it's absolutely critical, the vaccination program. I think just listening there to John's final point, one thing I would add is, from a potentially vested interest of our industry, but a number of those international acts are starting to come through. I think we've got, Guns N' Roses are scheduled in a couple of 4 or 5 months' time. Over in New Zealand, we're seeing them coming through already. An opportunity exists to, a lot of those international shows will tend to bring their own production with them. With that production comes more people from international, exposing us to, risk of outbreaks and things like that. The production capability exists in Australia, where we've described we're absolutely world class. Let's get the acts in, let's leave the production back in there and the people that come with their production back in their country, and service it from Australia. So when we're granting those permissions, as we will do, let's think about, I'd love to think we could think about that as a opportunity to help our industry recover.
Just on that, Matt, very quickly, Chair, that point, my understanding is that we're seeing a lot of international artists, be it music, acting, whatever it might be, but they're actually seeing Australia, because of the work that we've done around the pandemic, as a preferred destination. Now, understanding they've got to come in and quarantine, but, seeing the flexibility that we have,
safe here,
contrasted with the rest of the world, that people are starting to come here and organising that travel.
Yep, absolutely. Let's maximise the value of them coming in for our country.
Thank you. On that point, Matt and John, I just want to, on behalf of the committee, thank you both for sharing your experiences and insights on the way forward for the event sectors. And like I said, on behalf of the committee, I wish to thank you all for your contributions and presentations today. On that note, our next witness is ready, so the committee will take a short break before the next witness.
Thanks for the opportunity.